Well, good morning. Good morning, good morning. Good morning. It looks like I got all the buttons pushed here. I hope it works this time. Last week we had a little bit of an internet issue and it did not record everything, so I had to re-upload it. So if you're listening to this and you missed last week, it is on our YouTube channel. You just have to go and search for it. If you're looking for Isaiah 7 through 8. All right. Let's look at this morning at Isaiah 9 through 12, and we'll look at the big message here of what's going on this morning. This morning I went back to kind of my old ways because I wanted to go through, we hit it really good in the class. I thought we had a really good class, and that's really good, but sometimes we have other people listening here this morning, so I wanted to hit it again. The message of chapters 9 through 12, but I want to back up in the lesson and cover all the way from chapter 7 through chapter 12. Because the challenge of Isaiah, right, chapter 1, the challenge of Isaiah is for them to become the people of God, all the way from chapter 1, that justice shall come to Zion. Chapter 1 and verse 27. Zion shall be redeemed by justice. There was injustice going on right now, social injustice. But those in her who repent by righteousness are going to be redeemed. That is the principle of right action, and that hope from God, and that even though they have hope from God, that's not going to blot out the reality of purification against their arrogant rebellion against God, right? That's going to mean destruction for them. The call of Isaiah was for them to come and trust the Lord. That is what the first 2/3 of the book of Isaiah is about. And in the bigger sense, if we're going to look outside of Isaiah, right, we have Genesis chapter 12. So the families of the earth may receive a blessing through who? Through the family of Abraham. That's the big promise of Genesis chapter 12. That these people are going to have to know God well enough to trust Him implicitly here in Isaiah. Because no one will become a servant of someone that they don't trust. No one willingly puts themselves in servitude to somebody that they don't trust, right? Because what's going to happen? That person's going to take advantage of you if you don't trust him. If he's not trustworthy, anyway. And so, Isaiah last week, we looked in chapter 6, and the week before, Isaiah last week had this close encounter with God, where God revealed Himself in a powerful way to Isaiah, and Isaiah knew that he was a dead man. But God offered him purification. He touched his lips with a coal, and Isaiah chose to trust God. But now we have the mirror image occurring in chapters 7 through 12. The mirror image of that is that the Lord of heaven's armies, the Yahweh of heaven's armies, the sovereign of heaven's armies, the king, is offering to reveal himself to Judah, right? Isaiah goes up to Ahaz and offers to offer a sign. He says, "You choose, Ahaz, and I will show you a sign." He offers to do the same thing for Ahaz that he's done for Isaiah. And all. Proof that they can trust Yahweh, that they can trust God, that they will be blessed if they trust in Him. And Ahaz says, "No, thank you. I think I'll go trust in Assyria down the road." So, let's look at Assyria. And let's look at the geopolitical circumstances that are going on right now. See, because our story here is going to begin about 730, or in the mid-730s BC, into the 720s. And Israel, on this map, Israel forms an alliance with Syria up in the north. If we see Damascus, if we see Tyre, we see Sidon, and we see Samaria, that was Israel and Syria. And those two are trying to force Judah into an alliance, right? And because this had worked 100 years earlier. This had just worked 100 years earlier with Israel allying themselves with Syria, and they were able to hold off the Assyrian Empire for a little while anyway. But there would be no stopping Tilgath-Pileser. That's the name of the king of Assyria. Ahaz and Judah in general saw what was coming down the road at them, that no little two countries like Judah and Israel could stop Assyria on their own. And so with Assyria on the march towards the west, towards their ultimate goal of turning south and conquering Egypt, imagine this, and I use this example in the class. Can you imagine 3 mice, two on one, but the one decides to pay the cat to attack the other 2? Who's going to win? Well, the cat's going to win. At first, it's going to attack the 2, and then when he gets hungry, he'll take the 3rd one. This is exactly the situation that we have going on here in the Near East, the ancient Near East, during about 7 to 800 BC. So, chapter 7, let's start in, I said I was going to start in chapter 7. Let's do that. The threat of Assyria here in chapter 7 is met with the incredible force and power of a child. The theme of children who represent God and the strength of God, the Adonai, the sovereign, the Yahweh of armies, is a recurring theme here in the next few chapters. There's at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 children here that are mentioned. Depends on if you believe 2 of them are the same child, being called 2 different names. So, chapter 7 and verse 9, we've already got wordplay. Ahaz is fearful of Syria. He's fearful of Israel. He's fearful of everybody. Because Jerusalem is currently, while we're talking here, where does Isaiah go out to meet him? Chapter 7 and verse 1, Ahaz, not verse 1, let's keep going. Verse 3, and the Lord said to Isaiah, go out and meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. That doesn't sound very clear in English, but this was a place where there was water. That conduit is the equivalent of aqueduct. How important is aqueduct in the middle of a desert region, desert mountain region? It's pretty important. Ahaz is out looking at his water supply for his city, ensuring that it is secure against sabotage from Israel and the armies that are attacking him. And what happens? Verse 9, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. He won't even say the name of the king. He just says the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Some versions say that. That's the ESV. I like, if you don't stand firm, you won't stand at all. He's using the same word here. The Hebrew wordplay is if you don't believe. The word stand and firm, if you do not hold on to, if you do not trust, then you will not be trusted. You will not endure. And see, it's the same word in Hebrew. You can conjugate a verb 2 different ways, and I'm not an expert in Hebrew, so I can't explain them to you. But the Lord here is addressing the entire Davidic family and court. He's talking to Ahaz, but he's talking to the whole family of Ahaz, those people who are ruling over Israel, right? Because verse 4 was addressed to the king. So there's wordplay in the Hebrew text here that's designed to draw our attention to the alternatives that are set before the king. Chapter 1 and verse 20. Those things that are set before the king. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. These are the things that are before him. You can choose to do good. You can choose to believe. You can choose to te'amenu, and you will te'amenu. Or you can choose judgment on yourself. Isaiah is calling Ahaz to trust in God. And God even offers a sign to show Ahaz that he's serious, right? A son. The first sign is the son of Isaiah, and his name is Shear-Jashub. Chapter 7. That is the threat of Shear-Jashub. Because what does Shear-Jashub mean? You might have a little note in your Bible, meaning a remnant will return. Now, is this an encouragement or is this a threat? And the answer is yes. Right? There's hope in a remnant returning, but there's also a threat that only a remnant is going to return. Now, who is it that's returning? Well, that's kind of the point. This is a double or a triple or maybe even a quadruple entente or entendre. And what that means is that it has 3 or 4 different meanings that this could be taken as. So a remnant returning could be positive for Israel, if Israel is returning. Could be positive for Judah, if Judah is returning. That's already 2 meanings. It could be negative, because most of them are going to die. It could be Syria that is returning, that they have been defeated in battle, and there's only a remnant going back to Syria. That could be a positive there. The point here is that Isaiah is painting a portrait, and we talked about this in class too. In the foreground is some forest and some hills, and you can see the trees, but you can't see all the trees because there's trees behind trees, right? That's what a forest is. So you can see some of the trees, and you can see some of the hills, and these are the events of their own day. But Isaiah only begins by talking about this sign as a sign that would be for Judah and Ahaz, right? He says that this sign is for Judah and Ahaz. The second sign here of a child being born, verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, "Ask of a sign of your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol, the grave, or as high as heaven." But Ahaz says, "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to test." That's just false piety. I'm scared. I'm not going to test the Lord. I'm going to go over here to Assyria and see if they can help me. And he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you would weary my God also?" Because he's no longer Ahaz's God. It's now Isaiah's God, because Ahaz is denying God. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel," or in English, Immanuel. So Isaiah is painting this portrait, and he sees in the foreground this clarity that there's going to be the sign for Judah and Ahaz. But Isaiah ends his prophetic painting here with seeing the mountains that are beyond the immediate hills in the foreground. Those mountains aren't very clear because they got a forest covering up part of them. They got clouds drifting past. So you can only see, and then you can't see. It's like a painting, right? Nothing is more common here in Isaiah's tactics, in his book here, than for him to start a prophecy referencing some amazing deliverance from Assyria or from the dominant power that was attacking them, and then to end the prophecy by a statement of events that are connected to a further deliverance in the future under the Messiah. And so this sign of Immanuel, this son that is going to be born, the sign of Immanuel finds its ultimate fulfillment in the birth of the Messiah. And it's evident for us because we have the New Testament to go along with the Hebrew Scriptures. Matthew chapter 1. We read from it this morning. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 through 23. Oh, I'm on Malachi. Sorry, that's close. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. Now, we read that as Jesus Christ, and we think, oh, Jesus Christ, that's his last name, Christ. No, Christ is a title. Think Messiah every time you hear that. Jesus the Christ. Jesus the Messiah. Now, the birth of Jesus the Messiah was as follows. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, and then we have the story, we have the promise of Immanuel in verse 23, when Matthew quotes from Isaiah. And while this sign was first intended to show that Judah would be safe from this threatened invasion of Israel and Syria, Isaiah also sees a day when Judah would later suffer desolation from Assyria and Egypt. The very nations which Ahaz was seeking help from. That's what's happening there in chapter 7. Now let's move on. Because beginning with another sign involving a son of Isaiah, so now we have at least two children. It's my contention that this Immanuel probably was Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz. That's the other son of Isaiah, the prophet. So beginning with this other son, Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz, we find prophecies that are relating to this Assyrian invader, right? That Syria and Israel were going to fall at the hands of the kings of Assyria, who would then pass through Judah, seeking to destroy it as well. So Judah is encouraged to place her trust in God and his word. And what does Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz mean? Quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. There's not too much of a positive connotation when you are the plunderer and you are the spoil. Isaiah takes his son, who has a name like "you're going down," and brings him to Ahaz. Judah is encouraged to place their trust in God and his word with the assurance that better days are ahead. Better days are ahead. And so this sparks another glimpse into the time of the Messiah here in chapter 8, when his coming government are going to usher in peace and justice. Let me just read from verses 9 through 10, and it won't make sense in English when I read it, but it might if you remember what Immanuel means. Be broken, you people, and be shattered. Give ear, all you fat countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand, for Immanuel. Not a person. Well, maybe it is, because God is with us. Speak a word and it will not stand because God is with us. The point here of chapters 7 through 12, all these chapters, is you must trust in God. That's the lesson for us too, is that we need to trust in God. Ahaz was fearful. He didn't trust in God. He trusted in Assyria to come to his rescue. And so God gave him that first sign of a remnant returning, both positive and negative. And God is with us, though, through Immanuel, that sign, because there's only one way through the darkness, and that is through his light. And that comes as a sign in chapter 9. If we move on to chapter 9, the sign of a child that's going to be born. We've already had the children of Isaiah as signs. That's 2 or 3 signs there. Now we have a sign here in chapter 9 that unto us a child is born, to us a son is given. And the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of the hosts will do this. In the meantime, though, Assyria's schemes are going to be restricted by God, who is only going to allow the invader to do what he allows them to. Because we need to pay attention to God, because unto us a child is born. And so chapters 9 through 10 here, the second half of chapter 9, verse 8 through verse 10:4, is stylized as a poem. And there's a refrain in verse 12, in verse 17, in verse 21 of chapter 9, and verse 4 of chapter 10. Let me just read the refrains. The Syrians on the east and the Philistines on the west devour Israel with an open mouth. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. Therefore, the Lord does not rejoice over their young men, and has no compassion on their fatherless and widows. For everyone is a godless evildoer, for every mouth speaks folly. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is outstretched. Verse 21, can you guess what it says? For Manasseh devours Ephraim. Those were the 2 tribes in the north, 2 largest tribes. And Ephraim devours Manasseh. Together they are against Judah. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. Chapter 10, verse 4. Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is outstretched still. The fate of the people of Israel or Assyria, both of them, is determined by their relation to the standards of God. And so Ephraim's pride goes against the standard of God. They're relying on themselves, or they're relying on their relationship with Syria, their alliance with Syria, to beat Assyria. But they are nothing but leaders who mislead the people who are unjust, who steal from the people. Let me just read from chapter 9 real quick. Where was I? Ephraim devours Manasseh. Their leadership is doing nothing but devouring each other. And it's the tendency of humans, right, to exalt human leaders. This is the lesson for us today. It's our tendency to exalt human leaders and expect our problems to be solved by those humans that caused the problems. How does that work? And so the answer to this is, again, the wonderful, powerful answer of a child. Chapter 10 and verse 19. The remnant of trees in his forest will be so few that a child can write them down. We're back to that image of a child. There's hope, though, despite destruction. And this is really the start of Isaiah's gospel message. That God's kingdom will surpass all of the earthly kingdoms. And there's this ironic note there in chapter 10, verse 5 and 6. Let me just read it. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send them. Wait, I thought Assyria was the godless ones. Against a godless nation I send them. Against the people of my wrath I command him to take spoil and seize plunder. Sound familiar? That's because it has 2 or 3 of the same words that are in Maher Shalal Hashbaz's name. There's 4 words in his name. There's 2 or 3 here that match. It's bringing us back to the picture that Isaiah is drawing us. That these godless people, those Assyrians, that they are going to come against a godless people who was us, to tread down like the mire of the streets. Remember, they didn't have plumbing. They threw their crap out into the road. Now, they shouldn't have. It was technically, you were supposed to throw it outside the city, but that's not what was happening, right? They threw it out in the street. The horse pooped out there, the donkeys pooped, the camel pooped, whatever was out there, goats, chickens. The mire of the street is where they're going to be thrown. But from the branch of Jesse, we're in chapter 11 now, the father of David, will come one who will reign in righteousness and peace, in whom even the Gentiles will seek. And the Lord will recover his remnant of Israel a second time to participate in his reign. Chapter 11, that's what chapter 11 is all about here. So the Messiah is not just promised, he's not just announced, but he's depicted as ruling like a king. He's not just this person who's going to come, but let me tell you how he's going to come and how he's going to rule during that coming. He's like the signal flag showing that it's safe to return. And this Messiah would come not because of how good Israel was, but because of God's sovereign grace for us, the created ones. That as a father, he was longing for us to be back with him. And so what this announcement time sees, like envisions into the future here, is a time when this ruler would no longer see himself as privileged, as not just a ruler over the kingdom and as a really good guy who has a lot of money. But this ruler would be, would be responsible. That when he will come, he will become one for whom his people's welfare is the chief responsibility. That as a ruler, he is the one who has the welfare of his people in mind the most. If we back up and we look at the situation, it makes a lot of sense then. The ruler then would be serving the people, right? What do we call somebody who serves people? A servant. So the ruler would be a servant. Not because he was too weak to dominate, but just the opposite. Because he is strong enough not to need to crush people for his own ego and for his own advancement. And so this picture cannot be applied to a human king. it's either an unattainable ideal here, or this figure is somehow superhuman. That's my contention that it's the second one, because it's Jesus. So, then we have the Song of Trust in chapter 12, and they're these people who see this righteous child king, who rules in meekness, who rules in wisdom as a wonderful counselor, who rules with righteousness and justice. To him, they would be willing to offer praise because he is the solution. Well, let me back up and ask it this way. So, if we see all these things happening and Ahaz doesn't see what the solution is through God, and let's just step back and look at it from his perspective. If he's asking, what is your solution to the problem of evil in this world? See, he can't see it because of his pride. The pride that leads him to oppress the people. So what is the solution then to the pride and evil in general in the world? And the answer in chapter 7 and chapter 9, and in Matthew we find out, is a 15-year-old pregnant virgin, right? Who's a princess, right? Comes from a royal lineage. Well, sort of. She's more like a refugee, right? Who runs down to Egypt after having the baby. So in chapter 12, they sing this hymn of praise to God's wonderful salvation that comes through this child, through this young woman. And they go throughout the world here in chapter 12. They go throughout the world inviting other people to join them. And so that's the message that Luke picks up on. It's the message that most New Testament writers pick up on. That these messianic prophecies are looking to a time of the Messiah as a whole, a time in which the inauguration of the Lord's kingdom that this child is bringing, and its culmination are described in one picture that are all seen from a great distance away for Isaiah. That the final fulfillment and its timing, right? That's the first coming of Christ. And the nature of that coming, the literal nature of the kingdom, that those things can only be understood as they happen to us. And so Isaiah doesn't quite clearly see these things. So we need the help of these inspired interpretations from the New Testament, like Luke 24:44, I have here on the slide, that were provided to us through Jesus and through his disciples. So we see in Luke 24, quoting the principles of Isaiah. Well, he's quoting what happened to Jesus, but fulfilling what happened in Isaiah. Now, he said to them, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you." This is after Jesus. Luke chapter 24. Let me just turn there real quick. Yeah, this is right at the end of Luke. These are the words right before he rises into heaven. These are the words I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. These things are fulfilled, okay? Then he opened their minds to the understanding of the Scriptures and said to them, "Thus it is written that the Christ would suffer, would rise again, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem." This is the story of chapters 7 through 12. And the proclaiming of the forgiveness of sins is what chapter 12 in Isaiah is all about. Peter puts it this way, "But according to his promise, we are looking forward to a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." Peter picks up on the new heavens and the new earth language. because he wants the righteousness of God, because there is injustice, because there is suffering here. Peter wants something better than that. Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6 also says, "Is it too light a thing that you should be my servant, to rise up the tribes of Jacob and bring back the preserved of Israel? I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth." And so the message then for Judah and for us this morning is that his righteousness reaches to the end of the earth. And it's through this messianic king, this child king, who is going to overcome evil, who is going to defeat evil with goodness. Jerusalem was being threatened by Syria and Israel for refusing to join in their resistance against Assyria. And Ahaz and Judah were tempted to seek the help of Assyria, the cat, in the north, and they were tempted to ask Egypt for help also in the south. Isaiah and his sons were used by God to encourage Ahaz and his nation to trust the Lord, to not trust political alliances. And Isaiah's prophetic utterances, his prophetic sayings, not only looked to this immediate deliverance that God offered them, but also to the time that God would offer the ultimate deliverance for Israel and Judah. And so, if we could put a title on this section, I would call it Judah's True Hope, the Messianic King. Who will you trust? And so the lesson this morning for everyone is, who will you trust? Will you put your faith in the next president in the presidential election? Will they save this nation from ourselves? Because that was openly the claim that was made in the last 3 elections. That if we don't elect this person, our nation is a goner. This person is going to save our country. The only person that can save our country is a child that was born to a child. Because the power of God doesn't need warfare to overcome. So the power of God is available for everyone here this morning. If you're willing to commit your life to that, we can help you this morning. If you'd like to make that commitment, please contact us, sitkachurch@gmail.com, or if you're here in town, come by the building. We'd love to have a Bible study or talk with you. Have a good morning, everyone. Next week we'll look at chapters 13 through 16. We'll see you then.